When you sacrifice your identity for someone else, particularly for a man in the context of a relationship, you set yourself on a path that almost always ends in bitterness and disillusionment. A great tragedy in human relationships is when one partner, often a woman, believes that by erasing her own essence she is somehow preserving the bond. That belief is not only false, it is destructive. At the core of every meaningful connection is individuality, two distinct souls meeting as equals, not one collapsing into the shadow of the other. When you compromise who you fundamentally are, your values, your beliefs, your voice, you are not creating harmony, you are laying the foundation for resentment. And resentment is a toxin that poisons the well of intimacy. You have to ask yourself, why would a woman be tempted to give up her identity in the first place? Part of the answer lies in the deeply ingrained cultural expectation that women are supposed to nurture, to give, to bend, to accommodate. That instinct has evolutionary value. It preserves families, it maintains bonds. But like all instincts, it becomes pathological when taken to an extreme. The desire to nurture can transform into a willingness to self-annihilate for the sake of keeping peace. A woman tells herself, if I just give a little more, if I just make myself smaller, if I just let him decide, then everything will be fine. But peace built on the destruction of self is not peace at all. It is servitude disguised as love. And here's the deeper psychological problem. When you erase your identity, you rob the relationship of the very thing that made it valuable in the first place. What drew him to you initially? It wasn't your silence. It wasn't your compliance. It wasn't your willingness to vanish into the background. It was your uniqueness, your laughter, your intellect, your quirks, your strength. If you strip those away, you leave behind a hollow shell, and what happens then? The man begins to lose respect. He doesn't admire a woman who has made herself into a mere extension of him. He admires a woman who challenges him, who holds her own ground, who stands firm in who she is. In the act of trying to preserve love by sacrificing yourself, you actually dismantle the very structure of attraction. Identity is not an accessory. It is not a luxury that you can discard when inconvenient. It is the framework of your psychological house. Without it, you have no stability. If you crumble your own walls to accommodate someone else, don't be surprised when the roof collapses on you both. Relationships, at their best, are two houses standing side by side, not one house being dismantled to prop up the other. Consider how this plays out in practical terms. A woman who gives up her hobbies, her friends, her ambitions, her spiritual practices, her beliefs, all in order to fit the mold of what she thinks a man wants, creates an enormous imbalance. The man becomes the center of gravity and she orbits around him. For a while, this may even feel sustainable. But eventually, she realizes that she has lost touch with her own life. She no longer recognizes the person in the mirror. And when that recognition disappears, despair follows. She may blame him for controlling her, but in truth, she betrayed herself first. The tragedy lies in the fact that she thought she was showing love, but in reality, she was abandoning the very person capable of loving. The consequences extend beyond the individual woman. When one partner sacrifices identity, the relationship as a whole suffers. Intimacy thrives on dialogue, not monologue. It thrives on difference, not sameness. If both partners agree on everything, if one partner never expresses dissent, never asserts a boundary, never offers a perspective, then what is there left to engage with? The relationship becomes stagnant, suffocating in its false harmony. Genuine love is not about never arguing, it's about arguing fairly, disagreeing openly, and growing through the friction of difference. Without that, the relationship becomes an echo chamber, and echo chambers breed apathy. Now, some people will argue, isn't compromise essential in relationships? Of course it is. But compromise is not the same as self-erasure. Compromise means negotiating without betraying your essence. It means adjusting without abandoning yourself. For example, you might move cities for a partner, but you don't give up your career forever. You might accept that he enjoys certain hobbies you don't share, but you don't pretend to love them just to gain approval. Compromise preserves identity while fostering unity. Sacrifice of identity annihilates it. And there's a world of difference between the two. Another danger of sacrificing your identity is the loss of credibility. When you bend endlessly, when you suppress your opinions, when you always say yes, you become predictable, and predictability without depth leads to disregard. A man may come to see you as someone who cannot challenge him, and therefore as someone he does not need to grow with. One of the most profound roles a partner can play is that of the mirror, the person who reflects truth back at you, even when it hurts. If you refuse to play that role, you deprive him of the chance to become better. In a paradoxical way, by losing yourself, you fail him as well. From a broader philosophical standpoint, the refusal to maintain your identity is a refusal to take responsibility for your existence. Life is suffering, as I often say, and one of the ways we counterbalance that suffering is by shouldering responsibility for our words, our choices, our integrity. If you relinquish that in the name of pleasing a man, you are escaping responsibility, not embracing it. And life punishes escapism, it punishes avoidance. Eventually, the bill for your self-erasure will come due, and the currency will be your mental health, your joy, and often the very relationship you tried so desperately to protect. So what is the alternative? The alternative is courage. The courage to show up as yourself, even when it risks conflict. It is standing your ground when your values are challenged, speaking your mind when your perspective differs, and maintaining your pursuits even when they are not shared. It is saying, I love you, but I will not betray myself for you. That is not selfishness. That is the highest form of respect, both for yourself and for him, because in doing so, you give him the chance to love a real person, not a fabrication, and only when two real people meet. Flawed, strong, stubborn, unique can love truly thrive. The paradox of love is that it demands both union and separation. It demands that two individuals join hands while still standing on their own feet. If you collapse into him entirely, there is no union, only absorption. But if you preserve your identity while opening yourself to intimacy, you create the conditions for a relationship that is resilient, meaningful, and alive. Never sacrifice your core identity for a man, because when you do, you don't just lose yourself, you lose the possibility of real love. Disrespect is a subtle poison, and abuse is its full-grown manifestation. The tragedy is that many people, particularly women in relationships, learn to normalize these things. They convince themselves that it is not so bad, that it will get better, or that enduring it is somehow a testament to their strength. But enduring disrespect is not strength, it is self-betrayal. It is the abdication of your dignity for the illusion of companionship. And that abdication always costs more than you expect, because it corrodes your soul in slow increments until you scarcely recognize the person you have become. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for rationalization. We can explain away almost anything if it allows us to preserve a sense of security. When a man mocks you, you tell yourself, he's only joking. When he belittles your dreams, you whisper, he's just stressed. When he ignores your needs, you reason, he has a lot on his plate. Each rationalization is a brick in the wall you build around your own awareness. And with every brick, you trap yourself more deeply in a prison of denial. What you fail to see is that by tolerating these patterns, you are teaching him how to treat you, and more dangerously, you are teaching yourself what your worth is. Respect is not optional in a relationship. It is not something you earn by constant sacrifice or obedience. It is the baseline without which nothing else matters. Love without respect is manipulation. Intimacy without respect is exploitation. And commitment without respect is bondage. If you tolerate disrespect, you are not in a partnership. You are in servitude. The problem is compounded by the fact that abuse rarely begins as abuse. It begins as small dismissals, subtle insults, little acts of disregard. A sarcastic comment here, a raised voice there, a decision made without your input, a boundary pushed just a little further than you're comfortable with. These things don't look catastrophic in isolation, and that's the trap. You tell yourself it's just once, or it's not that serious, or he didn't mean it. But patterns are built in the repetition of small acts. Just as health is maintained by countless tiny good decisions, degradation is built by countless tiny concessions. Before long, what was once intolerable becomes normal, and what is normal becomes invisible. It's essential to understand that tolerating disrespect doesn't only damage the relationship, it damages your sense of self. Every time you allow yourself to be belittled or mistreated, you are internalizing the belief that this is all you deserve. And once you start to believe that, you stop aspiring to anything better. You silence your voice in conversations, you shrink your presence in social spaces, you dull your ambitions so they don't threaten him. You think you are protecting the relationship, but in reality, you are dismantling your own soul piece by piece. There's a psychological law that governs human interactions. What you accept, you encourage. If you accept contempt, you encourage it. If you accept neglect, you reinforce it. If you accept cruelty, you legitimize it. The man learns that he can cross boundaries without consequence, and with each unchecked step, he goes further. It is not necessarily because he is inherently cruel, though some men are. It is because human beings test limits. Children test their parents' limits. Students test their teachers' limits. Employees test their employers' limits, and partners test each other's limits. If you never enforce your limits, you are effectively announcing that you have none, and a relationship without limits is an invitation to chaos. Now, some will argue that tolerance is necessary for love. That is true, but tolerance has limits. Tolerance is for quirks, for flaws, for human imperfection. You tolerate forgetfulness. You tolerate differences in taste. You tolerate the little idiosyncrasies that make a person who they are. But you do not tolerate disrespect. You do not tolerate cruelty. You do not tolerate abuse. To confuse those categories is to destroy the very possibility of a healthy bond. Another error women often make is thinking that enduring disrespect is a way of fixing a man. They believe that if they are patient enough, loving enough, forgiving enough, he will change. But change does not emerge from tolerance of wrongdoing. It emerges from confrontation with it. If you do not hold a man accountable for his behavior, you deprive him of the opportunity to confront his own flaws, and by excusing his contempt, you make yourself complicit in it. You think you are saving him, but you are enabling him. And in doing so, you are losing yourself. It is worth reflecting on the fact that respect is reciprocal. A man who cannot respect you does not truly respect himself. He may mask it with bravado, with control, with aggression, but beneath that facade is weakness. True strength does not belittle others, it elevates them. True confidence does not need to diminish someone else's light, it welcomes it. When you stay with a man who disrespects you, you are not only accepting less than you deserve, you are aligning yourself with weakness disguised as power. And that alignment will drag you both into misery. From a broader perspective, tolerating abuse and disrespect contributes to a culture that normalizes it. Every time a woman excuses cruelty, she reinforces a cycle that her daughters and sisters will inherit. Disrespect is contagious. It spreads through families, through communities, through generations. To draw the line is not merely a personal act, it is a moral one. It is a declaration that such behavior will not be tolerated here, not in this relationship, not in this home, not in this life. Of course, setting that boundary comes with risk. When you say no to disrespect, you risk conflict. You risk losing the relationship. You risk standing alone. But the alternative is far worse. The alternative is slow death by erosion of dignity. Better to stand alone with integrity than to stand together in degradation. And ironically, when you enforce boundaries, you give the relationship its only real chance of survival. A man confronted with firm standards has two choices: rise to meet them, or leave. If he rises, you both grow. If he leaves, you are spared years of slow suffocation. Either way, you win. The refusal to tolerate disrespect is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the clear-eyed recognition that love without respect is an illusion. And illusions may comfort you for a while, but they always collapse. Reality always comes knocking. The reality is that you are a human being with worth, and that worth demands recognition. If a man cannot or will not provide it, then the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and paradoxically even for him, is to walk away. Respect is the foundation of all that is good in human connection. Without it, there can be no trust, no intimacy, no joy. To tolerate its absence is to sabotage not only the relationship, but also your own spirit. The path forward requires courage, the courage to draw lines, to enforce standards, to insist on dignity. And though that courage may cost you comfort in the short term, it grants you freedom in the long run. And freedom, coupled with self-respect, is the soil in which real love can grow. A relationship should never require you to abandon your purpose, because your purpose is not an accessory to your life. It is the very axis around which your existence revolves. When you give that up, you surrender not only your ambitions, but your vitality, your identity, and your future. And when you surrender those things, you do not end up with a stronger relationship, you end up with a hollow one, because a relationship that demands the death of your growth is not a partnership. It is a prison. Human beings are wired for progress. We are made to stretch beyond our present state, to reach for something higher, to transform potential into actuality. That drive toward growth is not a selfish luxury. It is a fundamental part of being alive. If you cut off that drive to maintain a man's comfort or to preserve a fragile peace, you are committing a kind of slow suicide. You are killing off the part of you that was meant to become more than it is today. And the terrible irony is that in doing so, you also damage the relationship because you remove the very energy and inspiration that made you valuable to begin with. It is a common story. A woman with ambition, curiosity, or creative energy meets a man who feels threatened by it. Perhaps he tells her outright to stop pursuing her dreams, or perhaps he discourages her subtly with small criticisms and dismissive remarks. She begins to believe that in order to keep the relationship, she must put down her tools, abandon her projects, step away from her pursuits. She thinks this will show devotion. She imagines that by sacrificing her growth, she will earn his approval. But approval bought at the price of your soul is never worth having. The respect you seek from him will evaporate precisely because you betrayed yourself to obtain it. What many fail to recognize is that a man who insists you abandon your growth is not asking you to love him. He is asking you to shrink so that he can avoid facing his own inadequacy. He does not want a partner. He wants a mirror that reflects his comfort zone back at him. But real partnership is not built on one person shrinking while the other expands. It is built on both people climbing their own mountains, side by side, encouraging each other to ascend further. Love is not about pulling someone down to your level. It is about reaching upward together. And it must be said, growth is not only about career or material ambition. It is about the expansion of the soul. It is reading books, cultivating wisdom, developing new skills, seeking spiritual depth, exploring creativity, nurturing health, building strength. It is about refusing to remain stagnant, to abandon growth in any of these areas because a man finds it inconvenient, is to trade your future for his comfort. That trade may look manageable at first, but its cost compounds with time. 10 years later, you will look back and see a life littered with the corpses of dreams you never dared to pursue, and you will feel the bitterness that comes when you realize you gave yourself away for nothing. There is also a psychological consequence to stifling your growth resentment. You may not feel it immediately. At first, you may even congratulate yourself on your sacrifice, but slowly the truth emerges. You begin to notice that while you halted your journey, he did not halt his. While you made yourself small, he allowed himself to grow. And that imbalance eats away at you. Resentment builds when sacrifice is not mutual. Resentment builds when your gifts rot unused. And resentment is one of the deadliest forces in a relationship because it erodes trust and intimacy from within. Another dimension worth noting is the example you set. If you abandon your growth, you signal to those around you, your friends, your family, your children, if you have them, that it is acceptable to give up one's purpose for the sake of keeping someone else happy. You normalize the idea that relationships require self-destruction, and that is a terrible legacy to leave behind. Growth is not only for you, it is for everyone who watches you, everyone who takes cues from your courage or your cowardice. Now, some may argue that compromise in relationships sometimes necessitates slowing down or adjusting personal goals. That is true. Life together does require negotiation, but there is a vast difference between compromise and abandonment. Compromise is adjusting the pace of your growth to account for shared responsibilities. Abandonment is throwing away your growth altogether. Compromise preserves identity while respecting the relationship. Abandonment erases identity in the name of preservation. And the paradox is that what you erase cannot be preserved. It is important to also recognize that true love does not fear your growth. In fact, it demands it. A man who truly loves you does not want you stagnant. He wants you alive, vibrant, continually becoming. He is not threatened by your ambitions because he understands that your strength does not diminish his, but enhances it. And if he is threatened, if your growth makes him insecure, then that insecurity is his burden to face, not yours to alleviate by diminishing yourself. Your purpose is not negotiable. It is not something you can pick up and put down at will without consequence. It is the through line of your existence, the thread that ties your past, present, and future together into something coherent. When you abandon it, you unravel. You may still breathe, still go through the motions, still play the part of a partner, but inside you will be hollow. And hollowness cannot sustain love, because love requires presence, and presence requires wholeness. The refusal to abandon your growth is not selfishness. It is responsibility. Responsibility to yourself, because you have one life and one chance to actualize it. Responsibility to your partner, because he deserves a whole human being, not a diminished fragment. Responsibility to the world, because your gifts, when cultivated, contribute to something greater than yourself. To grow is to fulfill your role in the grand tapestry of life. To abandon growth is to leave your corner of that tapestry unfinished. You must also remember that growth is attractive. A woman who continues to evolve commands respect. Her presence radiates vitality. She inspires. She challenges. She refuses to be taken for granted because she is always becoming more than she was yesterday. A man may try to suppress that growth out of fear, but deep down, he knows it is precisely that quality that makes her extraordinary. And if he cannot embrace it, then he is not equipped to walk beside her. So the principle stands firm: never abandon your purpose, never forsake your growth. A relationship that requires you to do so is not a relationship worth keeping. It may promise you security, but it will deliver you emptiness. Better to risk conflict, better to risk solitude, than to betray the core of who you are meant to be. Because in the long run, the greatest tragedy is not losing a man, it is losing yourself. Love and dependency are often confused, but they are not the same thing. In fact, they are dangerously opposed when left unchecked. Love is a choice, rooted in strength, in responsibility, in the willingness to show up as a whole person and meet another whole person. Dependency, on the other hand, is an attempt to use another human being as a crutch, a substitute for courage, a shield against the demands of life. When you confuse dependency with love, you set yourself up for a relationship that is not a partnership, but a form of bondage. And the tragedy is that many women fall into this very trap by thinking that saving a man carrying his burdens for him or building his life in his place is a demonstration of devotion. But it is not love. It is enabling weakness. You have to understand that every human being has a responsibility to shoulder their own load. Life is hard, suffering is built into existence, and no one is exempt from that fact. The only way to make life bearable is to take on responsibility voluntarily, to stand up straight and face the chaos of the world as best you can. If a man refuses to do that, and instead relies on you to carry him, then what he offers you is not love but dependency. And if you accept that arrangement, you may feel useful for a time, you may even feel important, but eventually you will realize that you are trapped in a cycle where you are drained and diminished while he remains stagnant and incapable of growth. That cycle cannot sustain love. Love is not about rescuing someone from themselves. Love is not about absorbing another person's refusal to grow. Love is about creating a space where both people can grow stronger together. When you mistake dependency for love, you allow a man to remain weak. You think you are caring for him, but what you are really doing is stealing from him the dignity of responsibility. And in doing so, you rob the relationship of its potential to become something meaningful. Because what good is a union if one person is always dragging the other, if one person is carrying the weight of two lives? That is not partnership. That is servitude disguised as affection. It is worth asking why women so often fall into this trap. Part of the answer lies in the instinct to nurture. It is deeply embedded in the female psyche to care, to heal, to protect. That instinct is beautiful when it is directed at children, at the vulnerable, at those who truly cannot survive without it. But when it is misapplied to a grown man who is perfectly capable of shouldering his own burdens, but refuses to do so, it becomes pathological. You end up mothering a man instead of loving him, and he ends up behaving like a child instead of a partner. That dynamic not only poisons the relationship, but also undermines the man's potential to mature. Another reason this trap is so common is fear. Fear of being alone, fear of abandonment, fear that if you stop carrying his weight, he will leave. And yes, he might. But that is not a loss, that is a liberation. Because if a man only stays with you because you act as his substitute backbone, then you do not have a partner, you have a dependent. And a dependent cannot give you the love, respect, and stability you deserve. To cling to such a dynamic out of fear is to guarantee long-term misery in exchange for short-term comfort. There is also a subtle but destructive illusion in dependency-based relationships. You may tell yourself that your constant sacrifice, your endless support, your willingness to build his life for him will eventually inspire him to change. You imagine that one day he will recognize your devotion, step up, and meet you as an equal. But this almost never happens. The more you carry for him, the less he learns to carry for himself. The more you excuse his irresponsibility, the more irresponsible he becomes. Human beings are shaped by what is demanded of them. If you demand nothing, he becomes nothing. If you carry everything, he carries nothing. That is how the cycle of dependency entrenches itself until it becomes nearly impossible to break. It is crucial to understand that love requires freedom, and freedom requires strength. If you are with a man because you cannot live without him, that is not freedom. That is bondage. If he is with you because he cannot function without your constant support, that is not freedom. That is slavery. Love is only possible when both partners can stand alone and yet choose to stand together. When you confuse dependency with love, you strip the relationship of choice, and without choice there is no love. There is only need, and need masquerading as love is one of the most destructive illusions of all. The truth is that carrying a man's life for him is not an act of generosity. It is an act of arrogance disguised as compassion. It assumes he cannot grow, cannot rise, cannot face the world without you. But every human being has the capacity to grow. Every human being has the ability to confront suffering. When you step in and remove that responsibility from him, you deny him the opportunity to discover his own strength. You become both his jailer and his crutch, and in the process, you destroy the possibility of mutual respect. Because how can you respect someone you secretly know would collapse without you? And how can he respect you when he sees you tolerate his weakness endlessly? Respect dies in the soil of dependency, and when respect dies, love withers soon after. There is a better alternative, though it requires courage. The alternative is to insist that love must be a union of strength, not of weakness. It is to say, I will walk beside you, but I will not carry you. I will support you, but I will not replace your responsibility with my own. I will love you, but I will not enable your avoidance of life. That stance may lead to conflict. It may lead to his departure, but it is also the only stance that creates the possibility of a relationship built on true love, true respect, and true growth. At the heart of this principle is a recognition that dependency is the enemy of maturity. A man who leans on you to solve his problems, to finance his laziness, to excuse his failures, will never become the man he could be. And if you mistake that dependency for love, you chain yourself to his stagnation. You make his refusal to grow your lifelong burden. That is not love. It is tragedy. And the only way to avoid it is to draw the line firmly. Do not confuse love with dependency. Do not mistake his weakness for intimacy. Do not accept his refusal to carry responsibility as evidence of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a willingness to be open, to be honest, to risk being seen. Dependency is simply an unwillingness to grow. They are not the same, and you must learn to tell the difference. In the end, the quality of your relationships will always mirror the quality of your boundaries. If you refuse to carry a man's life for him, you force him to grow. If he grows, then you both benefit. If he does not, then you know the truth, and you free yourself from a prison disguised as love. That is the paradox. What looks like loss is actually salvation. What feels like cruelty is actually the deepest form of care for him, because you refuse to enable his weakness, and for yourself because you refuse to abandon your worth. So the principle stands clear. Love is strength meeting strength. It is two people choosing each other freely, not clinging to each other desperately. It is responsibility embraced, not responsibility avoided. Never confuse love with dependency, because when you do, you don't just lose the man, you lose the possibility of love itself.